right, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Dialogue Not Division. We have a great episode for you today. We will be covering Neera Tanden, I believe we're saying that correctly, or the kind of controversy around her appointment to the Office of Management and Budget. We'll also be covering an interesting topic here where the Supreme Court deems the Pennsylvania case moot, and then there's some controversy around one of the dissenting opinions on that. I wanted to examine some of the rhetoric behind that and actually look at that dissenting opinion and decide whether or not some of that rhetoric is correct. And along those same lines, we'll be dealing a little bit with some voter ID and voter suppression. There's a big case for both of those, people calling for more election integrity laws, and a lot of people have been calling those voter suppression laws. And I wanted to get into that a little bit just because it relates to that Pennsylvania dissent document. So first, let's go ahead and start off with Neera Tanden. So as we all know by now, a couple months ago, Biden appointed Neera to the Office of Management and Budget. So as these confirmation hearings are going on, there's been a big controversy or a bit of a controversy around her appointment, and I wanted to weigh in a little bit on this. So along those lines, discussing that, of course, what happens is most of the Republicans come out against Neera for quite a few reasons that we'll get into here in a moment. And we have one Democrat senator here coming out and saying this quote here: "I believe her overtly partisan statements will have toxic and detrimental impact on the important working relations between the members of Congress and the next director of the Office of Management and Budget. For this reason, I cannot support her nomination." So assuming that all of the Democrats, except for him, vote for confirmation, and then all of the Republicans vote against it, this would put her confirmation to this position in jeopardy. So of course, like everything, this has become politicized quite a bit. There's quite a few different accusations going around here. So that was his official statement, of course, of why he did that. And a bunch of people have been coming out and calling him sexist or even racist because this, of course, is a woman. I believe the first woman to be appointed to this specific directorship, also a woman, a minority. So they've been coming out and saying it's racist. There's been a lot of things saying where this is a double standard. And then a lot of the Democrats are pointing at the Republicans saying that it's all a bunch of hypocrisy. The primary contention here, especially with the Republicans, has been around the tweets that she has sent. So she's been quite active on Twitter. By quite active, I mean very active. And many of those have been very pointed tweets. And so a lot of the controversy or why people are calling them hypocrites is because Republicans are really fighting back on Neera and having such a contentious person, or what they would consider a contentious person, in this role. That is one of the reasons. And then, of course, the other side's coming out after him, calling them hypocrisy. So before I get in, or hypocrites, I should say. So before I get into that, I wanted to cover what did Neera actually say on Twitter, because I think that's important to the conversation. So there was quite a few different things that Neera said, and I was only able to find a few of them on the official tweets because a lot of these were taken down. So many of these were, and by taken down, I mean I believe Neera removed them herself. So there was one where this is just an article here that's saying she apologizes after comparing GOP senators to Voldemort and vampires. I believe she compared Mitch McConnell to Voldemort, and she said something to the effect of Ted Cruz is so cold, or he's colder, that he has no heart like a vampire, something like that. It was kind of satirical, a little bit funny, but definitely divisive. I would never recommend that we call people vampires and things like that. It's a little bit divisive, nothing terribly out of line, I'd say there. Um, Another thing that was said as well, there was also called when Rupert Murdoch's, the news was announcing Rupert Murdoch's home was burning down. Neera said, "There's a God and she's unhappy." So it was kind of a gleeful tweet that this person that she disagreed with's house was burning down. And she called Tom Cotton a fraud. And to me, the biggest one I found is there was a tweet where basically it was just a very politically charged tweet calling RNC supporters basically supporting child abusers. So I was able to use the Wayback Time Machine, I believe is what it's called, and find an image of that tweet because it was taken down. So it says basically the Republican Party is gleefully supporting an alleged child molester, and everyone who gives money to the RNC is doing the same. So that's what the tweet was saying. Again, it was saying that they're doing this. I guess there was an allegation against one of the people. The Republicans were defending them or including that. So just kind of lumping in everyone that supports that, they're supporting child molesters. It's a little bit of a kind of extreme or us versus them language. Definitely not a lot of language that I would personally use, a little bit more heated. There's many more examples, but those are the ones that I was able to easily find online. Again, many of them were deleted or taken down. Not all of them were targeted at Republicans. So many, or quite a few tweets, I guess, Neera got into a flame war with Bernie Sanders. Definitely called him a lot of mean things from what I could tell. I wasn't able to find a lot of those specific quotes, but Bernie actually did question her during this, and he says, "Your attacks were not just made against Republicans, they were vicious attacks made against progressives, people who I've worked with, and me personally." And that was directly from Bernie Sanders, basically calling her out for, hey, there's a lot of vicious attacks. From what I've read, many of the sources close to Bernie say he's likely going to confirm Neera, but he did bring that up as one of the things, and he brought it up in the context of, are you going to change, or is this gonna continue to be how you operate? Should you be confirmed to this position? Fairly fair question, I'd say, from Bernie, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. So all of this, of course, there's some controversy. As you see, many of the things I found weren't, in my opinion, that terribly bad. There were things I would never advocate for tweeting or tweet. But so this is what Neera said in response to, I believe this was in response to what Bernie said, is my language and my expressions on social media caused hurt to people, and I feel badly about that. And I really regret it, and I recognize that it's really important for me to demonstrate that I can work with others. She said, I would say social media does lead to too many personal comments, and my approach will be radically different. So, per her own admissions, she admits to kind of stepping out of bounds and has said that that's not appropriate behavior, or behavior that she would advocate continuing should she get nominated. So, to me, what I'm reading from that is she herself has admitted she's kind of stepped past that line of what would be reasonable for Twitter, or maybe good conduct, I would say. So, with that, that's really... So that's one of the things it's saying. And other than that reason, also things I was reading. So I subscribe to one thing. It's called The Flip Side. It's a great little daily news thing that covers the issues. A couple days ago, they covered this one. And there was some different things, and they had blurbs from the different sides on why they were opposing this. I highly recommend The Flip Side to those of you that don't. You can go subscribe to it. Kind of gives little blurbs of both sides. I think it's normally fairly well done. Some other reasons that were listed in there by both in these articles that were quoted there and many other sources that I found. Evidently, she accidentally, I put that in quotes because although I really don't know, I guess people claim this, outed a victim of sexual assault in the company during an staff. So evidently, a major news organization broke an article about an anonymous sexual assault case or complaint or allegation. It was anonymous at the time. Neera worked for the company, went up in an all-staff meeting, addressed it, and named the person, and it was quite awkward. A lot of people say that it was a kind of a shaming, or it was putting down someone that was sexually assaulted. It was definitely not a good it's definitely not a good thing to do. And as quite a few people put in those articles, that's kind of the rule number one of bringing that up. When someone makes a complaint, you don't try to publicly oust them when they want to be anonymous. So that's really a terrible thing. I don't know if one mistake like that disqualifies you from office. Another thing that is commonly brought up is that Neera assaulted a journalist for bringing up or conflicting a view, and I believe it was the Iraq War. It was one of the wars. And by here when I say assaulted, she admits she pushed him. So it's a push, a simple assault, what I'd say. So there's some self-control issues that some people thought might be there. I haven't found video of that specific things. I can't say, there's a difference between a kind of get away from me, I don't want to talk to you, and a full out push. But from what I could tell, that did happen. Another big complaint that I saw from the right is that unlike all the other nominations, especially the Obama nominations, she has no OMB or budgetary experience to speak of. Mostly she's been around fundraising. So there was some attacks directly at that, the lack of experience. I believe Trump's nominee had a lot of business budgeting experience, didn't directly have OMB one, to be fair on that as well. And then there was some concerns brought up around some major corporation funding, meaning she took lots of money from corporations. I believe Bernie also questioned her on that one. Basically just had her confirm that those donations would not influence her decision in any way. So, of course, she said that it would have zero influence. One of the Republicans even came out and said, at this point, many of us have had some type of contract or work with some corporation where we've got money. That doesn't necessarily mean we're bought or paid for. So, again, that's another concern. It's definitely, there's an appearance that they might be in the pockets of in this case specifically, I believe it was a couple big tech companies. So there were some concerns there. And then the biggest one for me is she supported many of the 2016 election conspiracy theories. So several people, this is more people I'd say on the right, so that they'd be against her, a little biased, definitely, called her the Sidney Powell of 2016. So she went very, very hard into a lot of those conspiracy theories, the whole Russiagate, a lot of those, was very much pushing into, the stolen election narrative that was going on in 2016. So a lot of people question her judgment on that. So anyway, those are the main reasons I was able to find. And of course, what happens, and I think rightfully so in some cases, are that the other side are calling Republicans hypocrites. Why? Because Trump has been very outspoken on Twitter, to say the least, and has said quite a few different offensive things. So what their argument that they're making is, well, Trump said plenty of these terrible things. He was very divisive on Twitter. He pretty much did these things or worse, and you Republicans have been defending him this whole time. So you're a bunch of hypocrites. They also, I believe, mentioned another Republican nominee that did similar things on Twitter that also got confirmed. So it was one of those that was an interesting comparison. So I wanted to take a look into it, and I tried to find some of Trump's worst tweets. So I did some searches about the same amount of time I took for Neera's, and I found that he mentioned. Let me say I'm not a fan of the way he talks a lot of times. I'm definitely not a fan of some of his Twitter comments, we'll put it that way. But some examples of his more extreme ones, just on, searching for Trump worst Twitter ones, was he did call somebody, basically he said, I won't call them a bimbo because that's not appropriate. So instead I'll call them something else. And he said, so instead he called them, I forget what it was, but something a lot tamer. So it was one of those, he pretty much called somebody a bimbo. I'm going to say, if you're going to say, I wouldn't do that because that's not something, I wouldn't call him this because, it wouldn't be nice to say it here. You pretty much called him that. Basically saying I would call him that. He called somebody else a horse face. He called somebody publicly on Twitter, a different person, a liar. And he called a woman ugly and understood why. He said something to the fact of, I understand why your husband left you because you're so ugly. something to that effect. That's paraphrasing. And of course, a lot of the fake news, fake media, fake this and fake. So again, some fairly mean things, especially for a president of the United States. Definitely a lot of heated political rhetoric, I would say. Definitely right around the same type of thing that Neera said. So I think there's some truth in that. A little bit of, Trump played that same game. Both characters were fairly divisive on Twitter. By this, I mean Neera and Trump. I did find it interesting that a few people were quick to point out that in a year less time, Neera tweeted 30,000 more than Trump. So kind of they've both been on social media. I believe it was Neera was on about a year less long than Trump and still managed to post over 30,000 more tweets than him. So she was very, very active on it. However, as I said, there's a decent argument there for the hypocrisy. And that's kind of why I want to title this episode is Everyone's a Hypocrite. Because, yeah, there's some hypocrisy there. Republicans did spend some time defending Trump and some of his offensive tweets. However, I think there's hypocrisy on both sides here because now we have a bunch of Democrats as well that have been condemning and going after Trump and saying how he's a terrible, divisive person. They're running on this unity and Trump is bad. Trump is terrible. His Twitter is horrible. He's horrible on Twitter. He should never be doing things like that. And then now they're trying to defend Neera on doing just about the same thing. And so they're kind of trying to paint the Republicans as the hypocrites, but they set a moral standard and said this isn't right, and now they're saying like, well, it shouldn't keep this person from running in it. So I also think that if you're going to set a moral standard and say this is wrong, it should be wrong for both sides. And I think a lot of people would agree for something like that. If you're going to call somebody out, say this is wrong, this is inappropriate, somebody like this shouldn't be holding office, maybe you should do that for both sides of them. But the biggest things I think where I also see the Democrats being hypocrites here is more on the election conspiracy theories. Again, hers were more around the 2016 election. But if you all remember here, not that long ago, all the Democrats and 11 Republicans removed Marjorie Taylor Greene's assignments or political or committee chair assignments for nearly the exact same. Again, she was caught up in the conspiracy theories. She had some very heated stuff. She was talking about election fraud. They said she contributed to January 6th and basically threatened the Republicans that if you don't strip her from these, we will. And then when the Republicans didn't, they voted and stripped her all her committee assignments. And so here they are defending somebody else who's wrapped up in very similar conspiracy theories, just on the other side. So I think there's a little bit of hypocrisy going around for everyone. When you start seeing a bunch of the rhetoric about how this is just because they're racist, they have a different, or because they're sexist, they have a different standard because this is a woman versus a man. I looked into it. I didn't see a lot of meat to that argument. They weren't very able to articulate it very well. There was some arguments that saying, well, you confirmed so and so, and he was also divisive on Twitter. But you didn't confirm her, and you have a history of doing this. I'd prefer to look at arguments mostly on the face of the argument of what they're making. What I've found is that there are a lot of Democrats that don't this individual, not necessarily in Congress or otherwise. If you go and you search, there are posts from both the left and the right, a lot of them saying that one of my favorites, I guess I should say, was it was the case. It was the case against basically denying her for her tweets, but it wasn't a defense of her character. And they went in and said, hey, we'd like for people to be able to say what they need to on Twitter. They said some of the stuff she said is true. There's no reason to back down on that. I don't think that should disqualify her. And then they went into some of those other reasons that they listed and just said, hey, there's a lot of other character reasons and reasons why I don't think this is a good person. And I think what that article was titled. I think it was something. Yeah, that was that. There was another one that was like, no, you don't have to be sexist to be against confirmation. So overall, what I wanted to conclude from that, I think there's a fairly reasonable case against her being confirmed, meaning there is a lot of there is some grounds to say that Biden is calling for unity. He's saying it's time to come together, and here we've nominated somebody that's very divisive, somebody that's made a lot of enemies on both sides, has shown at times poor judgment. Perhaps even she admitted that she regretted tweeting those things. And here we are doing all that. Is this really what you need? So when Manchin comes out, whether you like him or not, but when he comes out and he says that I don't think this is a good fit to work across the aisle. This person has been poking at both sides, really trying to stir up strife. Doesn't really fit with who Biden wants or what Biden wants, meaning unity. I don't think this is a good person. I think there might be a decent argument there. And yes, my conclusion is Republicans are. So often, many of them tweet the same things. They do that. So yes, I think there's an argument there. And I also argue that Democrats are being hypocrites. In this case, everyone's being hypocrites. But the biggest takeaway I want is if you're going to advocate for a moral standard or a standard, I really want both sides to be consistent. So if you're going to say Trump is bad for doing these tweets, say that Neera is bad for doing these tweets. Now, I will say I was impressed by the little bit I saw of Bernie's questions to her. You know, he actually brought up the tweets. Many of them were directly against him. He brought up some of the other concerns and was willing to, even though he's on kind of the same aisle that is going to be confirming, he was still able to put the screws to her a little bit with that question. Now, whether or not he was trying to get ahead of a Republican answering that or not is a different story. But overall, I thought that showed a little bit better. I did think that showed some character there to say, hey, you know, this is a standard I've had, is that you shouldn't be tweeting things like this. You've been tweeting things like this. So are you going to change if we confirm you? I think that's a good thing to ask. So I was happy to see that. And of course, there's a good argument for once someone's done something, if they apologize, they're saying they shouldn't. Should that disqualify them from all public offices? I don't think so. I think there's a time where you need to be able to move on, I should say. However, a lot of those other stuff, there were a lot of other concerns that I could see as valid. So overall summary is, yeah, hypocrisy all around. And I do think there's a decent argument against affirming Neera. So I'd love to hear what you think on that. So feel free, if you're watching this on YouTube, drop a comment. If there's anything I missed, if there's another terrible tweet that I missed, feel free to bring it out. If you're listening on Anchor, you can also message on there. If you're on any of the other platforms, feel free to drop me an email at dialoguenotdivision@gmail.com. Let me know. I'd love to have a conversation. Maybe we'll include it in the next podcast. So moving on to the next issue here. One of the big things that came out is this article here. The Supreme Court won't hear the GOP's, by the way, I hate that acronym, the good old party. I really dislike that acronym, but the GOP's Pennsylvania election challenge. So that one came out. And so there's a little bit of controversy around this one that I wanted to discuss and dig into it. And I wanted to kind of show what I consider unhealthy ways of discussing topics. An example of that again. So with that, the Supreme Court, what they really ruled there is, so again, if you don't remember this, this is the case where Pennsylvania, so the Pennsylvania legislation, they expanded a bunch of the mail-in voter stuff for COVID, and they went and they said, no, we're not going to give you an extension. So basically, you still have to get it in by the deadline. The Democrats sued in the Supreme Court, or in the Pennsylvania courts. The Pennsylvania courts ruled that basically to keep it a fair election due to COVID, we're going to extend the deadline until 3 days after election. So they did that. There was some challenges in courts. Long story short, it didn't get heard before the election, and now the Supreme Court saying, no, the point is moot now. There's no point. Basically, this is over. The election's already decided, so we're done, and we're not going to hear the case. Well, a couple of the justices, Justice Thomas, came out with a dissenting opinion on that, and that stirred up a lot of controversy. And I wanted to cover some of that. I stumbled across this article that I just really didn't like how they discussed this, and it kind of sums up some of what I'm seeing here. So the first one here, or this one, is from Slate's. Clarence Thomas promotes Trump's voter fraud lies in alarming dissent. And then in the small text there, what he says, even the appearance of corruption is enough to justify voter suppression laws, according to the Supreme Court justice. So already right there, it's interesting. I'll get into that, but they already talked about voter suppression laws. So that's one of the comments mentioned in there. As we go through it, I'm going to point out just a few of the more heated or the more pointed things that they were trying to do in the Slate article. So looking here, it says, Justice Clarence Thomas is not backing down from the fight to legitimize Donald Trump's claims that the 2020 election was rife with fraud. Part of that, it talks about him doing his dissenting opinion, and it says Trump may be out of office, but his staunchest ally on the U.S. Supreme Court is carrying on his assault on the legitimacy of the election. So that's an interesting claim. So moving on, another thing they say, the SCOTUS's, so the Supreme Court of the U.S.'s conservative justices were so furious about the Pennsylvania decision that they attempted to shatter states' authority to run their own elections. So we'll look at that here. I want to look at that. So again, shatter the state's authority. So here they're saying they just want to take away their authority to run elections. Here it also talks about them infringing on their authority to set election law, which is very interesting. We'll get into that. They asserted that under the U.S. Constitution, federal courts can override states' courts' interpretations of election codes based on their own sense of what the state legislature prefers. So again, sounds terrible, whatever Justice Thomas did here. It sounds absolutely horrible. And then, of course, it talks about how Trump's own cabinet member, basically the person in charge of the election security, said it was the most secure election in history, grading his own work. Here, he didn't stop from condemning mail voting as a threat to election confidence. In a strikingly cynical move, the justice argued that laws curtailing mail voting may be justified without proof of fraud to prevent the appearance of corruption. And then it moved on to say that Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch now wish to exploit a moot case to award themselves immense power to override state courts and state constitutions to restrict mail voting and other reforms. So it sounds terrible. They're trying to take all the state's powers. They're wanting to set this. And here they call it this approach is a radical overreach on a subject that was never seriously up for debate before the Trump era. So overall, this article makes it sound like the justice is arguing, hey, we should go in there. We should be able to change their laws. We should be able to, according to this, he's really furthering these election integrity claims. He's, Trump's big ally on here. And I was like, wow, that's pretty extreme. That sounds terrible. And whenever I hear something like that, Supreme Court justice, and there's a couple other people that agreed with some of these opinions on there, and in this case, several Supreme Court justices all having an opinion that I consider perhaps unconstitutional and extreme. What do? I go and I look at the actual dissent, because that's what I think everybody should do instead of reading these articles. So here I wanted to walk through the dissent. I do understand that this is a wee bit maybe technical and hard to look at, but I wanted to go through and just read some of the highlights of what he was actually talking about. So first, Justice Thomas here talks about the case before. So he talks about them that in response to the COVID-19, the Pennsylvania legislature amended the law but decided not to extend the receipt deadline further. So here he's setting a kind of history of events here. He's saying that so the legislator they amended the law, and then they said, hey, we don't wish to extend the deadline. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Democratic Party sued, and they decided to extend the deadline over a clause in the state constitution that just said elections shall be free and equal. And what they were saying is because elections should be free and equal, that obviously means they need more time. Vague clause, but okay. So that's what he did. And what he's saying is that's a very interesting interpretation, or a broad interpretation of what that means. And then he talks about here where they're talking about it being a moot point. Not only did both parties or both sides agree the issue warranted centuri, or whatever it means. Basically, it means that it warranted that we actually look at this and do it. There was no question the petitioners faced irreparable harm. Basically, he's saying both sides agreed that this was a big issue. Both sides agreed that this was a big, big issue. And it's something that we should have been looked at. And should have been looked at before the actual election happens. So both sides agree that this is an issue. And then he goes on to say, the federal constitution, not state constitution, gives state legislators authority to regulate federal electioners. Petitioners presented a strong argument that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision violated the Constitution by overriding the clearly expressed intent of legislators. So what he's arguing here, more or less, is the power to set the election laws federal election laws was delegated to the legislature. Excuse me, that word doesn't want to come out of my mouth, but the Pennsylvania legislative branch. So what that means is they are the ones that get to set the time and the place. And what he's saying is they clearly went in and they said, okay, due to COVID-19, we'll allow some of the mail-in, we'll allow mass mail-in votes, but we will not extend the deadline. What he's saying is the legislation said, we're not going to extend the deadline. So they explicitly, in this case, or basically they said, this is what we will and won't allow. What he's saying is that immediately it was challenged. It wasn't, they didn't look at this because, again, what they're saying is the executive branch is the one that has the power to make this change. The executive power said, no, we're not doing this. And then the judicial branch for Pennsylvania said, actually, you are. So what he's saying is they're not the ones that have the power. The judicial branch doesn't make up the law. They only interpret them and decide whether or not they have a disproportionate impact, things like that. So he's saying is, so real quick, they brought up the objections to this. They denied the motion to expedite this request and hear it before a new president was put in here, even though that they agreed that it was of national importance and that there was a strong likelihood that the state Supreme Court decision violates the federal Constitution. So they looked at it, they decided that, but basically it was too close to the election. So they said, hey, it's too close here. And then he goes on to say, but now that the petitions are before our normal briefing schedule, I see no reason to avoid them. Moving on, here's what he's asking for, or what he's stating. Unclear rules threaten to undermine the system. They sow confusion and ultimately dampen confidence in the integrity and fairness of elections. To prevent confusion, we have thus repeatedly, although not as consistently as we should, blocked rule changes made by courts close to an election. So I thought it was interesting. The Slate article talks about how, historically he's been against that, but now he wants to change it. He's saying right here is we've very consistently been against changing rules right before an election. So in this case, what they're talking about is, extending deadlines. The judicial system extend a deadline or change the rule right before an election. So while people are doing stuff in that, so he talks about that. An election system that lacks clear rules, and here different officials dispute who has the authority to set or change those rules. This kind of dispute brews confusion because voters may not know which rules to follow. So here he's saying we have two different authorities. one side was given this authority, the legislative branch, but then the judicial system is changing these rules, which is effectively what they did. They said, hey, no, there's 3 more days. That's what it is. This kind of dispute, or who can change these, it brews confusion, which, fair enough. Obviously, there was confusion because 2 sides are arguing over it. Even worse, with more than one system of rules in place, competing candidates, I should say, might each declare victory under different sets of rules. And then he goes on to say, again, according to the Slate article, he's talking about, he's furthering Trump's voter fraud accusations and basically buying into that narrative and going to that. And here's what he says. We are fortunate that Pennsylvania's Supreme Court's decision to change the receipt deadline for mail-in ballots does not appear to have changed the outcome in any federal election. So, okay, he's not really pushing for this. He's saying it hasn't really changed the outcome in the election. That's good. That's not extreme in any way. But he goes on to say, but we may not be so lucky in the future. Indeed, a separate decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court may have already altered an election result. A different petition argues that after Election Day, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court nullified the legislative requirements that voters write the date on mail-in ballots. According to public reports, one candidate for a state Senate seat claimed victory under what she contended was the legislative rule that dates must be included on the ballots. A federal court noted that this candidate would win by 93 votes under that rule. So here's what he's saying is, here's an example of something that's already in our court system, where someone's saying, hey, I won because these ballots don't count. And then the court's going like, actually, they do. So again, that change to the system, or change of the rules by one branch mid-flight is causing a lot of confusion. And he just says that's not and then he also mentions that there's a second candidate that claimed victory under a contrary rule that was seated as well, or the second candidate did. So basically, second candidate won. So that is not a prescription for confidence. Changing the rules in the middle of the game is bad enough. Such rule changes by officials who may lack authority to do so is even worse. What he's saying here is we need to look into this, because this is basically it's people changing the rules right before or during the game. We're not even sure if the people changing the rules are allowed to. We need to establish where this authority is at so that people can be certain in elections. He cites a specific example of why that's a bad idea. And then, of course, he acknowledges in here that it is moot. It's already done. The president's already elected, all of that. And he says, at first it may seem reasonable to just address this when it next arises, because that's kind of the argument is, well, the point's moot, so we'll have to wait till it comes up again to address it. And he talks a little bit, the judiciary is ill-equipped to address problems, including those caused by improper rule changes through post-election litigation. Post-election litigation is truncated by firm timelines. So what he says is, hey, we don't work fast, more or less in this paragraph. Again, you can read it for yourself. Just look up the Supreme Court decision. It's very easy to Google. Here he's saying we don't move fast, and if an election's already done, we may not move fast enough. This is the case here, where the point is now moot. And he said this is especially true for presidential elections. And he gives on that, where he talks about how it's a fairly short turnaround, all of that. And he talks about the time frame imposes especially daunting constraints when combined with the extended use of mail-in ballots. He says mail-in ballots are often more time constrained. It can take a lot longer to count. And he gives specific examples of this. Here he talks about, for one thing, as election administrators have long agreed, the risk of fraud is vastly more prevalent for mail-in ballots. So that's where Slate's going. He's arguing that we're pushing this debunk theory that mail-in fraud is more prevalent, or all of this. We'll get into that in a little bit. He gives a citation for that, and he goes, the reason is simple. Absentee voting replaces the oversight that exists at polling place with something akin to an honor system. Okay, all right. Moving on past that, I'll address that a little bit more in the future. And then he says, Pennsylvania knows all of this well. Even before widespread absentee voting, a federal court had reversed the result of a state Senate election in Philadelphia after finding that the supposedly prevailing candidate conducted an illegal absentee ballot conspiracy and that the election officials covertly facilitated the scheme and the specific purpose of ensuring a victory for that candidate. He gives an example, a specific example. It's on a lower level court, but he's saying, hey, here's an example where it happened. An election candidate specifically did that. And he says 2 years ago, a congressional election in North Carolina was thrown out in the face of evidence of tampering with absentee ballots. So here he's providing some specific cases. And then he says, he goes on to talk, and he does talk about how mail-in ballots are a little bit more susceptible to fraud, and it complicates the review process. Moving on, he said that this sometimes forces courts to make policy decisions that they have no business making. For example, when an official has improperly changed the rules, but voters have already relied on that change, courts must choose between potentially disenfranchising a subset of voters and enforcing the election provisions. So basically what he's saying is this can put us in a terrible position. You saw this used as an argument by at least one court in one of Trump's other lawsuit cases, where he basically said, hey, let's just assume what you're claiming is true. Even if what you're claiming is true, I don't have the authority to basically, or I would have to disenfranchise all of these voters by saying that these don't count. And the majority of these, and I just couldn't do that. I'd be disenfranchising voters. I'd be kind of changing the rules. It wouldn't be seen good, and it would likely get overturned. So here he's saying we don't want to be making these decisions after the fact, because here we might be talking about, okay, the next time it comes up, we say, no, you weren't allowed to choose that, so never mind, the election goes to the other person. As you can imagine, that probably wouldn't go over well, especially if it was a presidential election, and it would probably cause a lot of issues. He does go on to say if it's off the system, in this case, it's often incapable of testing allegations of systemic maladministration, voter suppression, or fraud that go to the heart of public confidence in election results. That is problematic for allegations backed by substantial evidence, but the same is true where allegations are incorrect. After all, confidence in the integrity of our electoral process is essential to the functioning of our participatory democracy. So basically what he says is if there's clear evidence of this, this is vital. But it's also clear that, or it's also very important that people have confidence in the integrity of the election, otherwise they may not participate. And then he talks about an incorrect allegation left to fester without a robust mechanism to test and disprove it, drives honest citizens out of the democratic process and breeds distrust of our government. So here again, he's saying is you don't, at least in my mind, we talked about this a little bit, but the best way to combat disinformation, or in this case, an incorrect allegation, is not by telling people to shut up. That doesn't work well. That's been tested. It doesn't work well. What does work very well is here are the hard facts, and here's why what you say is not true. That is one of the best ways to say that is false, is by proving it's false. And what he's saying is we do need a process that can do that. I don't think there's anything too controversial about that, about saying, hey, we do need a way to basically say, hey, that's completely false. Anyway, he goes on to say, so what he's talking about here is there's some exceptions to the moot, because he agrees in this that this case is moot. It doesn't matter anymore for this specific questions. And he says the issue presented is capable of repetition, yet evades review. The exception to mootness, which the court routinely invokes in election cases, applies where 1, the challenged action and its duration is too short to be fully litigated prior to cessation or expiration, and 2, there is a reasonable expectation that the same complaining party will be subject to the same action again. So what he's saying is, yes, this is moot, but we have a precedence set where there are times where we may review this, and there's two qualifications for that. One is that it was too short for basically the time frame was too short to be fully litigated, and two, that there's a reasonable expectation. So here he talks about the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued its decision about 6 weeks before the election, leaving little time for review in the court, and which is true. There was very little time, and that's one of the reasons why they talked about not seeing it. They did, I believe, mandate that those extra, or the ballots that came in after that date, be segregated. And he alluded to that earlier, where he talked about because only so many came in after that date that would have been affected by this, it wasn't enough to overturn the election. So it's kind of moot, is where he talked about earlier. And then what he says is, one wonders what the court waits for. We failed to settle this dispute before the election and thus provide clear rules. Now we again fail to provide clear rules for future elections. The decision to leave election law hidden beneath a shroud of doubt is baffling. By doing nothing, we invite further confusion and erosion of voter confidence. Our fellow citizens deserve better and expect more of us. I respectfully dissent. So now that you've kind of read this, or we've read this overview together, or what he said, it's really not, in my eyes, what the Slate article said. He didn't really talk about, one, he didn't buy into any of the narratives that the election was stolen. He didn't say it was done on any kind of overwhelming thing that would overdo it. He did argue that mail-in ballots were more susceptible to fraud. He did argue that one, so that one was correct. Although he didn't really talk about, with that, he paired that with specific examples. And nowhere in here did I read about him wanting the federal system to be able to go in and just overturn laws as they please. Basically, a lot of the things that the Slate article was talking about just weren't there. He had a very clear opinion, at least for me. What he's saying is the federal government gave the state legislative body the authority to set the rules. They clearly said this is what we want our rules to be, in line with COVID-19. And then the judicial system used a very broad interpretation of just open and fair to extend it. And so they set they changed the rules from what the legislative body set, and they shouldn't be able to do that. So we need to settle who has that power and who can set those rules. The reason why we need to do that is because it being unclear doesn't foster confidence and can leave two sides hurt, and he went very detailed into that. To me, that's not an unreasonable opinion. Again, he's saying this is an issue. He gave specific examples of when it came up, or how it's came up both in Pennsylvania and another place. He talked about some specific examples, and he said this is likely or may come up again. And it's very likely to come up again. We didn't have time to look at it before. It falls under an exception to the mootness clause. So nothing I saw in there really that I saw was all that bad. You might disagree with it. Obviously, several of the other judges didn't follow that same logic. But really, that argument he's making, it isn't going full-blown Trump or anything like that. And so I thought it was just, yeah. And then going back to the title, I'll leave it there. Going back to the title here and looking at even the appearance of corruption is enough to justify voter suppression law. Now, in that article, I skipped a bit over it, but he did talk a little bit about, wanting some integrity things. He didn't mention any specifically that I heard of, but he did talk about, widespread mailing and wanted to know who could change the laws, things like that. But the word that was used in this article several times I saw this kept talking about voter suppression laws. Nowhere in his opinion did he say, I want voter suppression laws, obviously. A judge would never ask for suppression of voters. They know that wouldn't be legal or desirable. So I just thought it was such an extreme take on it. So obviously, what they're referring to there is the election integrity laws. that they're talking about. And when you talk about election integrity laws, almost inevitably what you come up to is things like voter ID. So I wanted to dig into it a little bit and just explore it in this episode. So I looked at a little bit on both sides of specifically voter ID because I wanted to cover it and learn a little bit more about it and find the pros and cons. I definitely had a preconceived notion of what I thought at the beginning. I wanted to check it a little bit, see some facts, do all of that, and see. Obviously, the person that wrote the other article had a very big opinion on election integrity equaling voter suppression. So, looking into that, I found a little thing. I believe this was the ACLU. And this is kind of their argument for why voter ID laws are suppression laws. So they say millions of Americans lack ID, 11% of U.S. citizens, or more than 21 million Americans, do not have government-issued photo identification. Obtaining ID costs money. Even if ID is offered for free, voters must incur numerous costs to apply for government-issued ID. They gave the example of a birth certificate. Underlying IDs cost money. You might have to get new IDs, all kinds of stuff like that. And there might be travel expenses. So basically, they're saying it costs money to get an ID. And then voter ID laws reduce turnout. 2014 GAO study found that strict photo ID laws reduce turnout by 2 to 3 percentage points, which can translate into tens of thousands of votes lost in a single state. And that sounds terrible. Moving on. Their other big point was voter ID laws are discriminatory. So many voters, minority voters disproportionately lack ID. Nationally, up to 25% of African American citizens of voting age lack government-issued photo ID compared to only 8% of white. There was a source there. I looked at it. I also saw, for both the people that lack ID, I saw a lot of conflicting reports on that. One person said basically that number was achieved by estimating based off of a survey. We already talked about that in a different episode, but that often overestimates something depending on how you ask it on a survey. And so what they did is they went to their state's official information and they pulled up how many people have ID and how many people in the state are over 18. And they found that there were more IDs issued because many states will let people under 18 get IDs. So basically they're saying, I have a hard time believing that's true, that 11% of people don't have IDs. Now that may or may not be the case for every state. And that's a good argument for that state. It wasn't a great argument, I guess, for the whole thing. But moving on with that, states include forms of ID in a discriminatory manner. Texas allows concealed weapons permits for voting, but does not accept student ID cards. Until its voter ID law was struck down, North Carolina prohibited public assistance IDs and state employee ID cards, which are disproportionately held by black voters. Until recently, Wisconsin permitted active duty military ID cards, but prohibited Veterans Affairs ID cards for voting. So let's stop there for a second. Whoever wrote this likely has nearly no idea what a concealed weapons permit involves versus other forms. So I recently went and got my concealed weapons permit in a different state, not Texas. So I'm speaking for a different state. It's far different than any other and far more stringent than any other type of ID that I have ever got, I believe. Maybe passport. No, I don't think so. So I had to fill out a bunch of paperwork. I had to do some attestations. I had to include copies as a veteran of my DD-214. So basically my exit paperwork to prove that I hadn't been dishonorably discharged. I had to go and get fingerprinted at an actual sheriff's office in person. And then, of course, I had to wait a bunch of time as they did background checks and all of that. And then I had to go in person again to actually to get a temporary ID, and then they mail you a card. It's by far, and of course, I had to show ID to get all of this. So it is by far more stringent than nearly any other ID I've gotten. I haven't been fingerprinted for many other IDs other than a military ID, which was another one that was brought up. Military IDs require fingerprints. Military IDs are in no way, I would consider, equivalent to a VA ID. VA ID is a little piece of paper. I don't know if it has a picture on it. I'm not in the VA system, not disabled in any way. I don't have any service-connected injuries that I've claimed. I don't believe it has a picture on it. I could be mistaken, but a military ID means you've also went through the background check. It's got a picture ID on it. Encoded on it is a bunch of things. There's actually fingerprint on it. It's not easy to get. We'll put it that way. Some of the other things they were talking about likely have some merit, perhaps. But when they talked about the concealed weapons permit, again, maybe it's different in Texas, but it's a lot harder to get that than many of the other ones they put on there. And it's definitely a lot harder to get a concealed weapons permit than driver's ID. So, yeah, that was, again, I just wanted to bring that up because I felt like they likely had no idea what they were talking about there. So again, they talked about voter ID. So their other point is voter ID laws are enforced in a discriminatory manner. A Caltech MIT study found that minority voters are more frequently asked questions about ID than are white voters. And then voter ID laws reduce turnout among minority voters. Several studies have found photo ID laws have particularly depressive effect on turnout amongst racial minorities and other vulnerable groups. So we'll get into that in a second. And moving on, they list as one of the big things is furthermore, ID requirements are a solution in search of a problem. In-person fraud is vanishingly rare. A recent study found that there were only 31 credible allegations of voter impersonation. Identified instances of fraud are normally honest mistakes. And they go on to say voter ID laws are a waste of taxpayers. And there might be some argument there. So that's some of their arguments. And then one of the other things I thought I liked was there was one when I was looking up, it was like Voter ID 101, the right to vote shouldn't come with any barriers. And a big part of it was you shouldn't have to pay for your rights. If you have a right to it, you don't need to pay. And as they mentioned in the other one against you do, even if you have a free ID, you'll have to pay for other pieces of paperwork to get it. So those were their main hard-hitting, I believe that was UCLA arguments there. So I wanted to take them and go through some of them. So first, when it talks about ID being too hard for people to get, a good portion of people don't have ID. One of the biggest arguments against that is nearly everything in life requires an ID. So what requires an ID? Let's look it up real quick. To drive requires an ID. To get on a plane requires an ID. So if you want to get on a plane, it requires ID. Buying alcohol, cigarettes requires an ID. Every bank I can think of requires ID to open up a bank account, oftentimes to cash checks, do things like that. If you look young, they may ask for ID and require ID for you to see an R-rated movie. You might have to have, you'll have to have ID to buy Sudafed, and pick up prescriptions at a pharmacy. You have to have an ID to get married, adopt a pet. In some instances, for a non-school child, you have to show ID to get in the school. This was the case at my child's school at one point. They added some security things, and I had to show ID even to enter the premises. You often have to show ID to donate blood, of course, to get a job, to get most major cell phones, for post office pickups. To apply for food stamps, to file for unemployment, and getting a hotel room. So those are just some of the things. Of course, most of us know this. Nearly everything requires some form. Nearly everything. Most people, the vast majority of people, their 11% number. We'll see. I don't have the biggest confidence that's correct. Even if it was. To argue that it's incredibly hard to get an ID, I don't think is correct. And they mentioned transportation to get an ID, all of that. So if that's discriminatory to require an ID, is it discriminatory to require an ID for all those other things? To adopt a pet, are we discriminating against minorities because they're requiring an ID? What about to have a hotel? What about to travel on a plane? Are we discriminating now against minorities because we're requiring some type of photo ID? I just don't think that holds much weight. However, the biggest counter to that is, well, voting is your right. And as a right, you have a right to it. So, and you shouldn't have to pay for your. So I'd like to point you to the bottom right thing on this list. Activities that require ID is buying a gun. Let me remind you that you have a right to a firearm. You have the right to protect yourself. And yes, buying a gun requires photo ID from any retailer. Private sales in some states don't. But for any retailers, and nearly everyone that argues for this also argue for universal background checks, and that would include ID for all buying a gun. There's a right specifically there enshrined in our Constitution that people are arguing that you need an ID for. So I don't think that holds a lot of weight. Again, say what you want about that. I don't think it's an undue burden. There's so many things that require an ID, and they do that to prove who you are. So yeah, moving on that, the other big one that you heard, or the two big ones you heard that sound terrible, and this is where they talk about voter suppression. You're trying to keep votes down. It negatively increases turnout, especially with minorities, because minorities don't have IDs. They can't get IDs. There's all kinds of stuff like that. And then it mentioned that there was a study, a 2014 study. What it doesn't mention is there are quite a few other studies, and very large studies, that have been done on this one. So this one was done by, actually, I forget who exactly this one was done by. Give me 1 second here. So the National Bureau of Economic Research did one here. And you'll see here, was their finding. They looked at data from 2008 to 2018, so 10 years of data. They went through, there's lots of math in there. There's lots of fun stuff. Feel free to look at it. The DOI number is on here, as well as who did it. And they found that the laws have no, strict voter ID laws have no negative effect on registration or turnout overall for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. And they're not the only one. There was another one associated with a group that Harvard's associated with, I should say. That one also looked at a bunch of statistics and basically said, hey, the way the data is, you can't draw that conclusion that it affects it to within 2 points, as the other one said. You could, depending on, the data has so many errors that depending on how you correct those errors, it could either say that there is or that there isn't, and it actually helps turnout. It went quite a bit into that and really kind of disputed that point there. One thing that was interesting as well is this article talked a lot about some citizens even being more likely to vote if the laws enhance their confidence in the fairness of election. It might be. Now, one thing that they did say is they looked at the data and were not able to find, they didn't see any effect on this. They said they were unsure if it's because perhaps there was a theory that voter ID laws do make some people not able to vote, but other people have increased confidence, so they want to go and they'll actually go vote. You saw this a lot with the 2020, the runoff elections. You saw some people like, why would I vote in Georgia? Why would I vote? Because the so-and-so cheated or whatever, so there's no point, things like that. The argument here is that there's a possibility that strict voter IDs might even increase turnout in some ways to offset that. Again, the study, I want to be very honest here, the study showed that they couldn't show a clear correlation that did increase the turnout. And then a few other things to go back a little bit, or go back, I should say. In the study, one thing I want to do before I get there, actually, so I'll go back before I go back. I will say I do want to show that study, that it showed that there was no significant effect. You may have noticed, if you have a keen eye, that at the bottom there it says that they also saw that it had no significant impact on fraud, or strict voter ID laws had no significant impact on that, either actual or perceived. So they basically took the data from states that had very strict voter ID, and then the data from those that didn't, and they didn't see, and then the data from before and after these laws were enacted, and they didn't really see a real strict impact on the perceived confidence of election just by that. And so their overall finding was, I want to be honest here, the findings suggest efforts to improve elections may be better directed at other reforms. So I wanted to be very honest with that one. Is that they did find that basically it doesn't affect it, but there's not a lot of evidence they found that that's a good investment for money. But now kind of circling back a little bit to the Clarence Thomas, they did talk a little bit or cite some sources about mail-in voting. And here they specifically did acknowledge that voting by mail, early voting, and other forms of convenience voting do increase turnout, but are more susceptible to fraud than in-person voting on election day. Now, it's a little bit older study they pulled that from, but it's interesting that they acknowledge that. Because again, according to the Slate article, no, that's not true. None of that's true. There's no evidence there, even though there was evidence cited directly in the dissenting opinion. And I was able to find this quite a bit. There are a lot of concerns where people say it could. Just because something that hasn't happened widespread yet doesn't mean that there's not a security flaw. So that was an interesting one. They also talked a little bit when they were looking and they were talking about, because the other argument, I should say, sorry, I'm a little over the place. The other argument, of course, is that this is a solution in search of a problem. So the other argument they were making is they didn't see any effect on voter fraud, but they had a whole section on this, which they said measuring voter fraud represents a challenge as federal and state agencies vary in the extent to which they collect and share information. They only found 2 data sets that covered it. The first by News 21, and that went on. So they said basically they had a bunch of people fill out FOIA requests, and with those FOIA requests, what they found about 2,000. They found about 2,068 cases of suspected voter fraud reported from 2000 to 2012, so 12 years, so not many. And of course, the database is admittedly incomplete. And then, of course, they found the Heritage Foundation, which includes 1,277 proven cases of voter fraud. 1,277 proven cases. So it was interesting that, this whole thing that election fraud doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's not widespread. It's interesting that, it does happen. As Clarence Thomas mentioned, there are instances in specific instances. There's over 1,200 that they found, many other suggested ones. If you look, there's a Wall Street Journal article that says evidence of voter fraud is present in all 50 states, and public confidence in the integrity of elections is an all-time low. And then they talked about in a 2008 study, 62% of American voters thought that voter fraud was very common or somewhat common. And then they talked about the fact that voter photo IDs are actually quite popular and have a decent amount of support. This is a little bit older data, but 82% of Americans supported it. And the latest number I've seen has only had that confidence just further erode into it. It does happen. There is some confidence issues in the election. So when they talk about it's a solution in search of a problem, there's some merit there in that it's not widespread common. When I looked for the official numbers in the other data set, it has went up significantly since the other article was published. So here is this one from that same place that they mentioned the database. So there's now 1,311 proven instances of voter fraud that they have in their database and 1,130 criminal convictions. So basically, these are the ones that were proven. Those were the ones where they actually convicted doing it. So there are quite a few. That's over many years. You can go to that data set that they mentioned here. That was the Heritage Foundation's data set. And they listed out and what it was and what the source was. There were quite a few that were mail-in ballots. There was also some that were impersonation. Not many, but there were some that was impersonation. There was a lot about vote harvesting. One of the interesting things that I did note from that same article I read about the turnout is they also talked about one of the biggest indicators of fraud or not was some of the other security mechanisms, and they specifically listed that things like having poll watchers and things like that had a better correlation or better effect on fraud, which is interesting because that's also a similar argument to what Justice Thomas was making. was basically he was saying those types of things provide some security, whereas mail-in one doesn't have those, so it may be more susceptible. So it's almost like that article very much backed them up. And again, I was able to find similar articles arguing against the fact that there is that effect, and basically saying that they don't believe the conclusions in several of these studies were either they don't believe they were correct, or they think that there was errors in the data, that once you correct the errors, it's unknown what your conclusion could be, or you couldn't find that correlation. So overall, I wanted to just kind of sum it up here is when you talk about clear voter suppression, I wanted to make the case that this is still something that's open for discussion. There is two sides to this. So when you hear Slate talking about, well, Justice Thomas wants voter suppression laws to prevent or to ensure confidence in the election. Yeah, he wants to suppress voters for that. I would just encourage you to realize that that's a very biased and slanted way of looking at it, because that's not what he argued for. What he argued for was election integrity, specifically to bolster confidence. There is some evidence that as you boost confidence in the election, you will also boost voter turnout. There's also some evidence that those tools that some people use, such as voter ID, do not actually have that discriminatory effect, and that many people, again, when you argue that it's an undue burden, it's hard to do with how many things today require ID. So overall, it's the argument that it might be a small price to pay to boost confidence and perhaps catch some fraud is there. And I really wanted to highlight how bad that I felt that Slate article. I feel like it was very slanted, and it was taking and intentionally manipulating and twisting the words of Justice Thomas. And so, of course, I did what I love to do is I went and looked up just to refresh my memory on where the bias chart was for the Slate. And no surprise there, it's on the extreme left. So I did want to mention it's there at the bottom left of this all sides media bias chart, all near the bottom. The Slate is the extreme left. So just a reminder when you're reading articles to always kind of check the bias. And when you hear things that sound terrible, or wow, I can't believe the justice said that justice is terrible, go read the actual article. I highly encourage you to go read the actual article. This happens way too much to me personally. I'll read something very extreme in the news or the media. That's the new combination there. So in the news and the media, there'll be something extreme, and I go and I dig into it and I find the actual real source, and I find that they've misinterpreted it, or I don't really agree with what they said. Sometimes intentionally, I feel like. Sometimes I don't think intentionally. This happens a lot for the Supreme Court justices. This happens a lot for people that are speaking politically. There was one show, it was one of the confirmation hearings. Somebody asked one of the, I think it was Merrick Garland. Yeah, they asked Merrick Garland, like, do you consider, so of course they consider the attack on the White House Capitol, extremists or domestic terrorism. Do you consider the attacks on the courthouses in like Portland domestic terrorism? And he provided he provided his definition of domestic terrorism. So the use of violence to basically cause fear and intimidation and interfere with the process. In this case, he was talking about the election for the Capitol. And he said, so when you're talking specifically about that attack on the courthouse, it happened at night. So no, it wouldn't consider it. And so the person says, well, he says, if it happens at night, it can't be terrorism. Well, that's not what he said. If you listen to what he actually said, he said that the definition means you have to interrupt the processes, the democratic processes or the processes. Obviously, by saying it happened on the courthouse at night, what he's implying is they probably weren't in session, so it didn't interrupt the processes. So in that case, no. By his definition, he would probably say if it happened while they were in session with the intention to interrupt it, the answer would be yes. I encourage you, when you hear a little bit extreme things, just to look into things, see what the person actually said. I see this a lot when people they misquote Trump, they misquote Biden, many political people, they just misquote them. So just go find the original, expand it a little bit, see the context, and then make a decision. You can try looking it up and fact checking it. I don't have a lot of faith in the fact checkers. I'd much rather make the opinion for myself if it's a clear thing like that, or I'll use the fact checkers as a starting point. But again, just keep in mind that everyone has biases, and especially that many sites are very biased and very slanted in the way that they say it. And overall, that is what I wanted to share for today. Is just my view on those couple issues, and of course a reminder that everybody in politics is a hypocrite. Right now, all we're seeing is both sides trying to play each other and trying to paint each other in a bad light. And so my argument is they're all hypocrites. So yes, the Republicans are hypocrites, the Democrats are hypocrites. Let's all hold them to their own standards. If they set a moral standard, let's hold them to it, and let's encourage them to actually to stand up for what they actually believe, or prove that that's what they actually believe. And then let's ourselves just always make sure that we look into the actual issues before we take those extreme sides. Thank you all, and see you next week.